the internet's least famous academic. I am a scholar of irregular warfare, air power, information, defense policy, amongst many other things. I'd like to welcome you guys back in. Hopefully we can have a fun conversation. This week is going to be something a little bit different. Instead of a couple of news stories that we're going to cover, about a week ago, the Department of Defense dropped the 2026 National Defense Strategy. This is one of the most important documents that is dropped by the Department of Defense it's supposed to be legally by every year, but it has become such a complex thing in some certain cases that it is dropped every couple of years. This is a big one because it's the first for the second term. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can see here I've got the unclassified Department of Defense, also known as the Department of War, National Defense Strategy. And what we're going to do is we are going to talk about it. This is going to be our National Defense Strategy talk. So what we're going to do here is first we are going to, excuse me. We're going to talk about the NDS, the structure of it. We've got the security environment and then the strategic approach. And then I'm going to give you some thoughts that I have for this. So first off, when we talk about the National Defense Strategy, what it is a bit of an introduction, kind of give us an idea of what we're talking about. And then what we also have is then we have the construction of what the world looks like in a security space. There are some areas that the Department of Defense wanted to hit on, and the ones here are the current state of the world, the things that they want to focus on, the security situation. Is we have the talk about the homeland, which in this case is mostly a discussion about the border, the porous or unporousness of it, the direct threats that can come from a porous border, but also we're talking about the hemisphere as well. In this case, there is a discussion about a return to the Monroe Doctrine with the Trump corollary. I have talked about this in other spaces, what this really means, but the biggest thing is that this is supposed to mean that the United States is supposed to be the dominant player within the Western Hemisphere, and that we are discouraging through strength to any powers, international powers, from operating within the Western Hemisphere. Next is the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party as well. This is the current state is that they are claiming, and I agree with them in this case, is that the Chinese are the second biggest national power. It is really important to understand where China sits in all of this. One of the concerns is the security, freedom, and prosperity within the Indo-PACOM region, which is the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. In the Department of Defense, this is called Indo-PACOM, the Indo-Pacific Command. It's a fairly recent change within the last 10 years or so. It used to just be PACOM, the Pacific Command. And yes, so China is a rising threat in the region. They are a peer or near peer competitor, depending on who you talk to. And one of the things that they are talking about here is that we want to start looking at things around what was called the first island chain. We'll talk about that later when we get into some of the strategic talk here. Next, they talk about Russia. Russia is one of the areas here where I struggle with this one because Russia is an ally, or not an ally, is a threat to our allies in NATO. They are currently conducting a war within Ukraine. However, one of the things that the National Defense Strategy adjusts and talks to is about economic output and mostly about our NATO allies and their defense spending. So, and I think that's a conversation to be had, but that is there's less talk about the risk of Russia, other than a brief mention of the longstanding war in Ukraine actually demonstrates that Russia has a national will to conduct combat operations. The fourth of the concerns of the state of the world is Iran, which makes some interesting claims about the success of strikes on Iran, claiming that the nuclear program has been completely destroyed, but at the same time, Iran is a threat because they seek a nuclear weapon. It seems to be contradicting itself a little bit. it is fairly interesting. They do talk about Operation Midnight Hammer, which is the one where they talk about the strike. And here they also talk about Israel as a, quote, model partner and model ally, end quote. And I have some concerns about that, the problematic nature of the way Israel has conducted its war in Gaza. But I get where they're coming from in the fact that Israel is an ally that spends heartily on defense, even though they are heavily reliant on the U.S. in that case. So I'm interested to see what goes from here. The next is North Korea. In the NDS, they called it the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which is the actual technical term, but we just call it North Korea in most cases. Here, this is a fairly short one, and I don't really have much to say about their claims here because I think it's really important. They talk about the threat that North Korea poses to both South Korea and to Japan, as well as U.S. and U.S. forces, and that the threat is growing in size and sophistication, and that was something that we need to talk about. And then the last bit of the state of the world is the simultaneity problem. Essentially what it is talking about like simultaneous problems to have. And what this is it's an introduction to a concept of burden sharing, which is something for those who have studied NATO and allied things in the past, for it to be a discussion on who's spending what. And it's not really a state of the world, but I think it's a concern that they have. Next, what they talk about is the strategic approach, right? And what this lines up there are 4 lines of effort that the Defense Department is going to work on. Number one is, and this is the one that I feel that they spent the most time discussing, was defense of the homeland. There are some things here that I think that are really good. They talk about securing borders, counter narco-terrorism, and securing key terrain. So these are things that are interesting. And we'll get into this in my final thoughts. But securing the border, that's self-explanatory. Countering narco-terrorists in the hemisphere. Also, I feel that that's self-explanatory. I question if that is should be an actual DoD priority, even though it is something that U.S. Southcom and the Department of Defense have worked on in collaboration with law enforcement in the past. The next is secure key terrain in the Western Hemisphere. And what this is this continues some of the bloviating around Greenland and the Panama Canal. Yes, that those are key areas. The Panama Canal is specific about economic growth and access to power projection through the ability for American naval forces to pass through, as well as American and international trade. Greenland is an area of concern for Arctic security, and that is something that we have talked about. This is, I believe, the 4th week in a row that we've talked about Greenland here. But also they talk about protecting American airspace against both conventional and drone. Modernizing American nuclear forces. I think this is something that is really interesting because while there has been a continual drawdown on nuclear weapons across the globe, there are states that are not party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty who are continuing to try and develop nuclear weapons. Iran is an example for one, as well as others. And the U.S. does need to modernize its nuclear forces. There's been a lot of ink spilled in the last 10 to 15 years about the state of the modern American nuclear force, and I do believe that this is a good thing that they need to talk to. Deter and defend cyber attacks. That's something that we always need to talk about. And then the last one there is countering Islamic terrorism. I think that is a little bit too specific, but we can get to that in a bit. The second, the second line of effort is deterring China in the Indo-Pacific. And this is mostly talked about just portraying strength and then working with China to make sure that we have a decent peace. It references President Trump talking about a decent peace. I have not heard this speech that is constantly referenced. but it is interesting in the fact that most of the goals of this line of effort tie around economics, about America being able to trade, and less about things centered around the first island chain, or anything like that. Third is the increased burden sharing with U.S. allies. This is one of the things that even from the first Trump administration to this one today, I am 100% behind the President Trump in this space. I do believe that Europe does need to increase its defense spending and needs to be more efficient with it. However, I disagree with some of the claims that they come about. This makes some pretty strong claims and changes some history about the previous Biden administration, claiming that the Biden administration was actively seeking for our European partners to be like freeloaders, and while they were not as aggressive as the Trump administration, there was pushes for NATO to spend more on their own national defense. And I think this is really interesting. They do spell out some examples. They talk about Canada and Mexico in the Western Hemisphere, and this is mostly about immigration and narcotics instead of actual defense reasonings. And then as well as exercising influence over strategic land holdings of Greenland and the Panama Canal. In Europe, again, it talks about increasing defense spending with NATO, with the Trump administration getting a guarantee of 5% of GDP spending on military expenditures, on defense spending, which I actually think is a very good thing. There's a brief talk about peace in the Middle East, which I feel like is something that has been talked about since I was a child, the 90s. And an even briefer talk about Africa, where the U.S. is going to be mostly focused on fighting Islamic terrorism, which I think is short-sighted, as considering that not all terrorism in Africa is Islamic-based, as we have seen with things like the Lord's Army in the past. And we need to make sure that we're doing other things there. The Korean Peninsula also gets a brief discussion where they talk about it comes across as maybe a rebalancing of forces on the Korean Peninsula, where Korea is meant to take a bit more of a lead in their own defense, and it reads almost like there's an intent to withdraw some forces from Korea. The fourth and final one, which I really like, is they call it the Supercharge the U.S. Defense Industrial Base. I have talked about this on my YouTube channel previously. I have written about it in some coursework. I took a whole course essentially on this, and I'm taking another one here soon on the economics of national security. And I'm very concerned about the current state of the defense industrial base. While I am not an expert, I am not a business guy, I'm not a business strategist. I think it's really important to recognize the fact that we have shrunk from 51 prime contractors post-World War II to now 5 major prime contractors that supply the majority of Department of Defense acquisitions programs. And one of the things that they talk about here is creating a foundation of rebuilding and adapting our military so it's the strongest in the world. I agree with that. We need to have a defense industrial base that will produce, deliver, and sustain critical munition systems and platforms. I think this is really, really, really important that we create an industrial base that is much more nimble, adaptable, and innovative than the ones we have now. It takes 16 years to get a platform from design to implementation in the Department of Defense. And right now, I think that this is one of the key things that we have. So those are the big things. There's a conclusion that kind of wraps everything up, but it's a fairly short document. I encourage you to read it. I'll post a link in the description, but here it is again, the 2026 National Security Review, or not the National Security Review, sorry, the National Defense Strategy. It's about 35 pages, nothing really big. But what we have here are my final thoughts. I think there are some concerns that I have here about this. There's a lot of discussion about how America has been too concerned with the liberal rules-based order. Well, that's revisionist history, right? It's the liberal rules-based order that the United States created that helped bring about the strength of the American century. Right. So we need to make sure that we understand where this is going. You know, there's a reason that the United States moved itself from the Monroe Doctrine, right, which is hemispheric isolation here in the Western Hemisphere. And then that becomes political dominance in a neo-colonial way that it is problematic to the foundations of the global systems that America is built on and American success is built on. So I think that is utterly concerning. As well as some of the language that it takes on with our allies and partners. There is language about how America has fostered a freeloading attitude towards especially our NATO allies. And again, this is revisionist history. You know, a lot of the NATO partnership is an unequal alliance of power. The United States has been the most dominant economic power in the world for 80 years. And you cannot expect Estonia, Latvia, and Italy to have the same impact on the treaty. And so the United States, as well as some of the other partners, have asked for our NATO partners to have specific skill sets. They will provide and augment American forces in specific niche ways, and that has always been the case. And yes, I do believe that burden sharing needs to be more common. I believe that there needs to be some higher spending in Europe, and there needs to be a bit more responsibility for European defense. I think that browbeating and shaming our allies is not the way to go about it. There are a few things that I find that are missing within this national defense strategy. There's no talk about irregular warfare, the gray zone. There's no talk about air power or Taiwan. Let's go those in order. Tied together, irregular warfare and the gray zone, I think they can be used interchangeably. I don't think they really should be. But these are both activities that are taken short of war, right? They're conflict short of war. And if we want to maintain any kind of dominance within the world and our power, we need to understand how gray zone and irregular warfare operations are going to happen, because that's what our adversaries are doing. That's what our near peer competition is doing. We know we need to talk about how within the gray zone, soft power is really important, about how aid and anti-poverty programs could help bring up and create more stable worlds. But unfortunately, we have lost that. That is no longer seen as a key part of strategic security planning, which I find very disturbing. And I think that there is kind of within this administration a fetishization of violence. And violence is not the only way to obtain strength or to project strength. I think it's the idea of Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly and carry a big stick. We've lost the speak softly part. Air power is vastly concerning for me as a former Air Force special warfare operator. While air power will never win a war, it sure can make it easier, right? The joint force is very important and integral to success. Any success that we had in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Desert Storm, and in Panama, like all of those things happened because of the joint force, the integration of air power, sea power, and land power together. I would like to see a bit more of a focus on what we're going to do with our aging platforms, how we are going to engage in any kind of psychological operations, anything with information warfare, what are our ground forces looking like, what are our maintenance programs looking like. Those are some things that I would like to see a bit more focus on. Lastly, the one that for me is one of the more concerning is there's no discussion about Taiwan. While there has never been an official U.S. government policy, it has been heavily inferred and implied that the U.S. will come to the aid of Taiwan. This has always been one of my personal things that have bothered me the most about American power and imperialistic actions of the past, is that we haven't always done the best job of supporting democracies across the globe. And in this case, Taiwan is a fairly well-functioning democracy. They are constantly under the risk of invasion from a bigger neighbor that shares a very small stretch of water for a border. And I would like to have seen some sort of discussion about that. But I think that what we're seeing is the effect of this idea of a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, where we are becoming isolationist. And in this interconnected global world, I think that's problematic, and I think that it's going to bite us in the ass if we continue to go down that route. I did see, now I've read a couple of articles that I've really liked. I will post them in the thing below if you want to read them. This is a really unique document in the fact that President Trump's name is mentioned so much. In most cases, you might get a one or two thing on the president, but I believe it was 35 or 40 times that President Trump was mentioned in his policies. This reads more like a rah-rah thing to get people to get behind President Trump instead of serious strategic thought about defense planning. I will say there are some things that I agree with. I love the idea of burden sharing. I think it's something that we've always had. I think it's one of the few good things that I have seen out of the first Trump administration was the fact that our European allies did begin to spend a little bit more on their defense spending. There has been more thoughts about unilateral defense. You see it in the Scandinavian countries. Germany especially has really begun the process of rearming to the point where they have reworked some constitutional things. The UK has always been serious. France has taken another bit. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this goes. Again, I'm going to agree also with the modernization of the nuclear force. I think we need to make sure, because a safe nuclear world also requires a modernized nuclear force. I'm not going to pretend to be a nuclear scholar, but I think that's something that it is a key to, like, the nuclear deterrent has kept the world from a massive war for nearly 80 years now. And I think it's something that we need to make sure that we are at the top of our game. And then the last one is, as I talked about earlier, the rebuilding and adapting of the defense industrial base. I mean, we're seeing it with a lot of companies. Now, granted, right now, some of the things that are happening are exceedingly problematic with companies like Palantir and Will. I don't know what it is about Tech Bros and the Lord of the Rings, but they do love naming their companies after things in the Lord of the Rings. But I think it's really important for us to take a look at how we are operating, especially in the Department of Defense, when it comes to the defense industrial base. I think there needs to be, not only within the civilian side, but also in the DoD, a platform where we can revitalize the acquisitions process, how we go about requests for proposals, all of those things. So I'm really interested to see how this gets implemented, what our longstanding effects are. I'm not necessarily a fan of this national defense strategy. I'm going to be blatantly honest with you. There are good things here. I will always admit when there are good things, but I think we really need to reevaluate what our Department of Defense is there for. The securing our borders, that's law enforcement. That's not a national defense or a Department of Defense policy. Yes, there are national security implications to a porous border. However, that is policy about immigration, immigration reform, worker visas, things like that. That is something that is outside the scope of what DoD should be engaging in. I don't like the idea of hemispheric isolationism in any form. We are way too interconnected into the world to just step back. So those are some of my thoughts. I hope all of you guys enjoyed and learned something today. I will put a link to the National Defense Strategy in the thing below. As always, if you got some value out of this, please go ahead and gently caress that like button. Go ahead and subscribe if you're not. It really does help show the algorithms of all of our spaces that this brings value to you and that other people might find it interesting. Also, if you're interested on YouTube, go ahead and hit the notification bell. Bong that thing pretty hard so it gives you that satisfying bong. And then also, if you feel like supporting me financially, you can always go to my Patreon page, which right now there's only one tier. I don't have anything special for it. It's just purely for you to support me. I'm trying to figure out what that's going to be, as this is a weekly podcast that really cannot be pre-recorded. There's not a lot of early access opportunities, but I'll figure something out. Maybe we'll get a Discord going or something like that and we can chat. But as always, y'all, I hope that you got some value out of this. Please feel free to leave your comments down below in the comment things. And until next time, y'all, I'll see you at the end of the week.